my very great pleasure to welcome you here tonight for this wonderful presentation by Jared Bernstein. This is one of the very last programs that we're having on our series. Our 2-year theme of inquiry has been From Wall Street to Main Street, Capitalism and the Common Good. And we've had a number of speakers, but I have to say that we've eagerly awaited Jared Bernstein because of his knowledge and expertise. A lot of us are his fans and have followed his work for a long time. So we are very happy to co-sponsor this event with the Oregon Center for Public Policy. They've actually done the bulk of the arranging, and I want to thank their staff. I also want to thank all of the Wayne Morris Law Fellows and the Wayne Morris staff for putting this together. And okay. It's my pleasure to give the podium to Chuck Sheketoff, who is the longtime founder and director of the Oregon Center for Public Policy, does fantastic work on our behalf in the state legislature. Chuck.
Welcome and thank you, Margaret. Truth in talking here. Margaret and I are in a mutual admiration society. Margaret was on our board for a number of years, and I still seek her counsel at times. So she's been doing great work. I also want to let folks know that I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Oregon Center for Public Policy, but we're a little research institute with offices in Silverton. And when we publish material, we send out emails, and a sign-up sheet for that is being circulated through the hall. So please sign up. And if you don't sign that, if you later want to, on our website it says "Keep me informed" and it says how to sign up on there. When we got the announcement about this year's theme, From Wall Street to Main Street, Capitalism and the Common Good, we immediately thought of Jared Bernstein. Why is that? Well, President Obama was surrounding himself with quite a few people from Wall Street and with Wall Street roots, and there was no better economist who understood Main Street, in our mind, than Jared Bernstein. And he also really understands the common good. He began his first book, non-economic wonky book, called Altogether Now, Common Sense for a Fair Economy, talking about the allegory many of you know about the different ways people eat in heaven versus hell and why they starve in hell and do well in heaven. And he thought that was a good backdrop for one of the main themes in the book that you'll hear about tonight, about the choices we have in governing and in our economy. The choices between those who think you're on your own, and he calls those yo-yos, and those who think we're in this together, the wits. And, it's really appropriate for Oregon. Sometimes our pioneer spirit, pioneer on top of the Capitol, sort of portrayed as Oregon. We're the pioneers on our own in independence, but we also all know that the pioneers that came across the Oregon Trail were in it together in teams of horses and people working together to get here. Today you're going to hear hopeful ideas about what those of us as wits need to do to address income inequality and economic growth. Jared and I are in a mutual admiration society as well, and I'll tell you, I've got to do a plug for his blog on the economy blog at jaredbernstein.com. You sign up for his little email update, you get a nice little automated email that gives you the subjects. It includes his musical interludes, which are quite eclectic, and I suggest you click on those as well. And it's my great honor and privilege to introduce my friend, Jared Bernstein.
Thank you, Chuck, for that nice introduction. Thank you, Margaret, for inviting me. It's a great crowd here. This is a really great turnout. So I want to quickly make my statement, go through some of these slides, because what I think some of the best parts, hopefully, are talking together. So I'll go for about 30 minutes or so, and then entertain your questions. When I worked for the White House, I said, I'll talk for a while and then I will evade your questions. Before I start, though, I do have, by the way, it's jaredbernsteinblog.com is my blog, and I noted on my blog that I was coming out here to speak here and in Portland tomorrow, and I suggested that if anyone around here, they ought to come check it out. And I got a note from someone who wrote a commenter on the blog, who said, I convinced my U of Oregon daughter and her roommate to attend your talk today. Try to be interesting. She doesn't follow my advice often. So I don't know, are you here? If that person leaves, that means I'm not interesting. So stay where you are. And thank you for coming. And this is economics, but I do try to be interesting. So that seems sort of an ambitious. Now that I look at it up there on the big screen, that seems kind of ambitious. But I think I can deliver on an explanation of what's broken and how to fix it. Let me see if I point this. Am I not pointing this in the right direction?
Double check if it's on.
So these things often don't. Oh, okay. Boom. Someone who knows what they're doing.
No.
I wanted to talk about what's broken and how to fix it. I want to bring largely a national perspective, but I have tried to pay a lot of attention, often through the excellent work of Chuck's organization, the OCPP, is what's going on out here in Oregon. But in fact, Oregon is very much a microcosm of the rest of the country in this regard. Some of the problems are worse, some are better. But one of the things that I think, and I think these pictures I'm about to show you, are most strikingly problematic about the American economy is the increase in economic inequality, whether it's wealth, income, wages, or even power, which in many ways is kind of at the heart of my discussion. And the thing about the inequality data is that there are many different types, many different series of data, and all of them have their advantages and disadvantages. I'm going to zip through this part because I suspect that this crowd at this august institution doesn't need a ton of convincing that we have a serious inequality challenge that we face. Whether it's a problem or not is part of the discussion. But the reason I like this first slide on the left there is that it shows a long time series. It goes back to the 1940s all the way through to the most recent data. And what you have there are middle, low, and high income families. So the 20th percentile family is the one that has 80% of the families earn more, 20% earn less. So that's low income families. The yellowish line, I'm colorblind, so I hate trying to tell you what color you're looking at. But the middle line, which I think is yellowish, is the median, or the 50th percentile, and the top line is the 95th percentile. And what you see is that between the late 1940s and the mid-1970s, they just grew in lockstep. And in fact, we've indexed these numbers to 173. So what you can tell there is that they went from, they doubled. Is that the incomes of middle, of low, of high income grew at the same rate. They all doubled over this period. And there you see them spread out like, the tendrils of a squid or something. And you see that the income at the very top of the scale grew much more quickly than the middle or the bottom. Now there's one pretty notable exception in there, and that's, I'm just going to step over here. If you look, I don't think this has a laser pointer here. If you look right up there, you can see that there was a period there in the 1990s where, out of this kind of income slog that was going on, the incomes of middle and low income people actually started growing considerably more quickly there for a few years. That's going to be an important part of my story. You can see, by the way, that that slope is steeper for the 95th percentile, but nevertheless, I'll get back to that. That's the 1990s full employment story that's very important to my presentation. On the right, this is a shorter data series from the Congressional Budget Office, but the reason I like it so much is because it's so comprehensive. It captures parts of the inequality story that other graph leaves out. Most importantly, it includes realized capital gains. Realized capital gains, if you're studying inequality and you don't pay attention to the income that primarily wealthy people get from the appreciation of their assets, and realize just means that you sell your capital gains, and if you bought a stock at 100 and you sell it at 200, that doubling there, that extra 100 is a capital gain. You have to include that in the data because it really drives the very top fractiles of the income distribution. And what in fact you see there is the top 1% really pulling away from the pack. And you don't get that if you don't capture the capital gains part of the story. This slide I kind of enjoy because it presents two things. One, a very long time series, going back to 1913 of inequality data taken just from market income. But the bottom are data that just came out a few days ago, just for 2012. So this is like a very long time series and a snapshot of the most recent data, and they both tell a story about rising inequality. The lines there just in the top graph just capture the share of income, the share of national income going to the top 1% to the top half of the top 1%. So this is not unlike the CBO thing I showed you, but it's a very long time series. And what it shows, the only thing I wanted to show you here is how uniquely excessive the extent of inequality is in our economy. Going back to 1913, you can't find a peak that's as high as that last one at the end there. It was in 2007, where the top 1% had something like 22, 23% of income. You have to go back to the roaring 20s to have that extent of income concentration. And then you see it comes down though. And there were people saying in the Great Recession, you can see those lines come down at the end. And during the Great Recession, people were saying, oh my goodness, we've solved the inequality problem. Well, we didn't solve the inequality problem. What happened was a lot of rich people had big capital losses, a lot of middle class people too. But remember, I was telling you that if you want to track income inequality in America, or in any advanced economy today, but particularly in America, you have to pay attention to asset income, to capital gains, to the appreciation therein. And guess what? As soon as the economy began to recover, GDP growth was positive from the second half of 2009, remains so today. That growth began to once again do an end run around middle and low income families. You can see that tick up at the end, and inequality is off and running again. And this graph at the bottom is just the most recent picture of it. These data are still warm, hot off the press. And what this just shows is the earnings data. The Bureau of Labor Statistics provides earnings data kind of every quarter. So I was able to just take the 2012, plot it, the change between 2011 and 2012. For the lowest wage earners, weekly earnings fell by 2% in 2012. For the highest, they went up by 2%. It's that staircase, that inequality staircase that you saw in the first graph. When they were after growing together, they started growing apart. So I just wanted to give you one picture of Oregon, where you see again a microcosm of the larger story. If you kind of look at the longer term there, which is in that top right-hand corner, you see that for the lowest 20% of Oregonian families, up 5% from the late 70s to the mid 2000s, and so on. So again, I'm not going to spend time on that. I'm sure Chuck, maybe you could make these slides available on the OCPP site if people want them. Okay, that's pretty much the data presentation. I wanted to zip through that so I can talk about what I think this all means. I've been working on these data, on this topic of inequality for 20 years. 25, long time. Lots of years. And I was an economist at the Economic Policy Institute in DC, writing books with my colleagues, showing pictures like these, and I must say, to our credit, I think we were some of the earliest folks out of the gate worrying about these. But in a way, I think our worries were not grounded. We were presenting these pictures of higher levels of inequality, not unlike the pictures I just showed you, and saying, look folks, isn't this alarming? And some folks thought it was, but I don't think we took enough time to figure out why. Why is this problematic? It's endemic to capitalism to have unequal outcomes. I mean, we have never had an economy where income has been equally distributed, and we never will. And there are good reasons why that's the case. Inequality of outcomes is endemic to capitalism, it's endemic to life. Some people work harder than others, some people have more of an endowment than others, some people don't care so much about income. They care about other things. But inequality of opportunity, now that's different. That's different. That's something that strikes more at the heart of the American social contract, of our basic concepts of fairness. We pride ourselves, and I think most advanced economies do, certainly capitalist and Democrat ones do, we pride ourselves that if someone is born into this economy with a certain level of potential, of intellectual potential, of economic potential, of academic potential, we'd like that person to be able to get somewhere close to realizing that. We don't believe in equality of outcomes, but we do believe in equality of opportunity. What is if there's a linkage between inequality and opportunity? Then we have a problem. What if inequality itself is dampening opportunity? I think it is. I'm again going to zip through some pictures. These are kind of circumstantial evidence of the claim that inequality is impinging upon opportunity in a way that's inconsistent with values that many, and I'd say most of us hold. This is a picture, by the way, there's a book, an academic volume, but here I am in a university, so I'm sure people eat academic volumes for breakfast around here. A book called Wither Opportunity that these next few slides. Wither Opportunity, well you can see it at the bottom there. Wither Opportunity. And these slides come from that book. The first one is a look at opportunity as a negative function of inequality through the enrichment expenditures that parents spend on their kids. Okay? So I live in Alexandria, Virginia. I've got a 13 and 11-year-old. We spend formidably on their enrichment. In this case, music and art lessons, books, sports, tutoring. But what's interesting about this slide is it shows the difference between the top income quintile, the top 20% and the bottom 20%, by enrichment expenditures on kids from the early 70s, before this inequality problem started to get bigger, to the latter, to the 2000s, when you saw inequality was at very high levels that we haven't seen since the late 1920s. And what you see is that the expenditures by parents on enrichment goods for their kids went from a multiple of about 4 to 1 to a multiple of about 7 to 1 over this period. And in fact, in real terms, it doesn't look like there's all that much growth in the bottom quintiles expenditures, and there's a lot of growth in the top. Enrichment expenditures have grown. The gap, the difference in enrichment expenditures on kids has grown right along with inequality, much as you would expect. At the same time, fewer of these kinds of activities are offered in public schools. So if you want your kid to have art lessons or participate in sports, or to have extra help if the class is too large, you often have to pay for it. And that is, to me, one example. It's a microcosm, but it's one example of this relationship between inequality, how inequality is mapping onto the opportunity space in ways that I think are negative for opportunity and mobility. Linked to this concept of opportunity is mobility. Now we don't expect everyone to go the same distance in their life, but we do expect, much in keeping with this opportunity theme, that people will be able to be economically mobile based on their skills, their hard work, their endowments, things like that. I mean, their academic endowments, not their economic endowments. And here we see the top line shows men with more education than their fathers, women with more education than their mothers. Over time, the bottom line shows the opposite, men with less education. And you don't see a huge trend here, but you do see a bit of an upside down, an inverted U, where you see a bit of downward education mobility of children relative to their parents. And on the other hand, you see some of the opposite effect in the bottom part there. Here's a very important one. This is the fraction of students completing college by income quartile for two different cohorts. The bottom line, the dotted line, is for a cohort that was going to school, to college, when inequality was much less severe than it is now, and the top line is a more recent cohort, the 79 to 82 birth cohort versus the 61 to 64. So the bottom line was going to and trying to complete college in years when inequality was lower. And you definitely see the more recent cohort line is on top of the earlier line, so more kids went to college and completed college. But the thing I drew in there is the differential. 31% more children completed college from the earlier cohort in the top versus the bottom, compared to 45%. So, 14 percentage points more of a differential there in college completion. I'm just going to, in the interest of time, zip along here. I have other slides that emphasize the eroding of opportunity, the other slides that show you pictures of how inequality erodes opportunity. And I suspect that's not the hardest thing for people to wrap their heads around. It kind of makes sense in an economy like ours, where so much opportunity is kind of a function of the family and the household and the private sector. Okay, so let's organize our thinking here. Actually, what's mine if I just wrote one. Let's organize our thinking a bit with a model. I think that these kind of sequential models are helpful ways of putting this kind of thinking together. In normal times, economic growth occurs. I guess I'm calling normal times, in that first slide, the period where incomes at the bottom, middle, and top are all growing together. In normal times, growth occurs. It's outside of the model, exogenous if there are economics or statistical students in the audience. Growth occurs, and it filters throughout the income scale. Poverty goes down, living standards go up, people access opportunities and mobility. Okay, very simple. This is just the simplest possible economic model I could give you of an economy that's working for a lot of things. Growth occurs, growth reaches the very people responsible for that growth. If you're baking the pie, you get a slice. If the pie gets bigger, you get a bigger slice, right? So this is kind of productivity and incomes kind of growing together, as opposed to growing apart. Okay, add the wedge of inequality. Growth, and there's an asterisk there, I'll get back to that in a minute. That's a very interesting asterisk, in my humble opinion. Growth occurs, but the wedge of inequality diverts growth up the income scale. Inequality becomes a wedge, a funnel, if you will. Growth no longer flows to the middle and the bottom like it used to, it just flows up. So what happens? Poverty rates stagnate and wages do as well. Now, I started noticing this back in the 1980s. In the 1980s, and I was research, dissertation, economists like me were scratching our heads, going, why is the poverty rate so sticky? The economy's getting better, but poverty's not going down. We started to notice that wages were stagnant for middle-income families in a way that they hadn't been before. And it began to look like, for any given level of GDP growth in the economy, the amount that was reaching middle and lower income people had diminished. Income was somehow doing more of an end run around people that it used to reach. And that led to poverty rates that were far less responsive, far less elastic in economic terms to growth in ways that they had been in earlier years. Now, I've added, based on the kind of dynamic I was talking to you about before, and this is a model. This is not necessarily a description of reality. I mean, so far it has been a description of reality. But this is a model of what I think is happening, compressed into a small little picture here. Less access to opportunity. Because of sticky poverty rates, income stagnation, folks who were on the wrong side, the have-not side of the inequality equation, had less access to opportunity, diminished mobility, and this is key, I'm now veering from the economics department to the political science department, in an era of deep money in politics, which we do in America like nobody else does, concentrated income leads to concentrated influence. That blocks the very policies that would push back against the inequality and supports the policies that make it worse. And you're stuck in a vicious cycle. Now, the only thing I'll add to that is there's now some thinking that says part of that vicious cycle is actually slower growth. So not only does this kind of snake eat its own tail in the sense that inequality begats more inequality, because through income concentration and pervasive money in politics, I mentioned power as a key part of my story, the diminished opportunity, diminished mobility feeds back into itself through a political system, which is where I do my day job. I'm in Washington, D.C., and I'm here to help them. I'm here to try to inform. Through a political system that feeds into a politics which is actually pretty dysfunctional right now, a politics that worsens the inequality and blocks the solutions against it. This next slide is probably not a good slide in terms of what you can see. So this is for me, not for you. Actually, I'm going to take this off. This model makes a lot of predictions. It predicts regressive tax changes, I don't know, like locking in a 30-year single sales factor tonight. Sorry, that was a dig. It was a local dig. This predicts that, this predicts the politicians who are trapped in this cycle where concentrated income drives concentrated power and a politics of inequality, support regressive tax changes, which, by the way, the last election was absolutely about. I mean, the electorate was asked to choose between basically supply-side trickle-down tax policy or something, a little bit more progressive. Shift from labor, I'm not even going to go through all this. Diminished unionization, opposition to collective bargaining, increased outsourcing of jobs, and so on and so on. I'm not going to go into, I may come back to some of this stuff. The point is that the model predicts a politics that looks somewhat like the politics we have today. In fact, there has been a very large shift of national income from compensation to profitability, to the profit side. The financial markets have been very much deregulated. That's something you'd expect in this kind of a model. Unions have been very much on the run. Again, comes right out of the model. Diminished government commitment to education would come out of this model. There's been some of that, but perhaps not as much as you'd expect. An erosion of safety net programs. Again, we've actually done okay, but it is worrisome. I think we've actually done worse at the state level. Few rules restricting campaign finance. That's happening. Diminished investments in public goods. Finally, anti-Keynesianism and pro-austerity fiscal policies resulting in slack labor markets and output gaps. That's happening. Let me try to translate that into English a little bit. Anti-Keynesianism is the idea that the use of fiscal policy to temporarily offset demand contractions of the type that we saw big time with the Great Recession is very much on the run in terms of political thinking. And even in terms of policy thinking. We especially see this in Europe, where Keynesian policy, where Keynes himself was of course, born in the UK, and that's where his career. Yeah, they're turning to austerity in the land of Keynes, and in political discussions today in Washington. If you say, one of my other jobs I do is go on cable television and argue with people, and the other day I was arguing with someone about this, and I mentioned Keynesian policy. And a woman from some conservative organization would say, well, look, he just said Keynesian policy. Like, that was enough to say he must be wrong. He said Keynes. And we ought to be doing more on the fiscal policy side. Your own Dr. Mark Thoma, who I talked to, one of my favorite economics professors here, anywhere, but he's here at Oregon, was agreeing with me on this point earlier, that we ought to be doing more fiscal policy, but we're not. So ask yourself, why not? Why not? Why is this woman on cable TV allowed to tell me that if you say Keynes, you're wrong? Why are we not doing more? Well, you have to think about it in the context of this model. where it's not an accident. It's not an accident. Okay, I only have a few more minutes, and I hate these people who end their talk without telling you how they're going to fix things, and then they say, you know, I'll tell you that later. Never mind. So there's kind of two bins of what to do about this. One is what I call the obvious stuff, and I don't know how obvious it is. I just mean that it's on people's agenda. If you're Chuck Sheketoff working at OCPP, if you're me in Washington, D.C., these things will be familiar to you, and you will probably be working on that. So the first is basically kind of a complicated way of saying we have to make sure that we are budgeting enough in both federal, state, and local budgets to provide people with the opportunities they need, which in this case means overcoming the inequality barriers. Okay, NDD stands for non-defense discretionary. And we are squeezing the heck out of that part of the federal budget. We've cut $1.5 trillion in federal spending so far. You know, these people run around saying we haven't made any spending cuts. Boy, are they wrong. We've cut $1.5 trillion in federal spending. That's $1.5 trillion over 10 years. That's the way we measure these things. Since we started this recent deficit reduction efforts back 2 years ago in 2011. We've cut $1.5 trillion, and it's all from the discretionary part of the budget. Now that's part of defense, so you know, from my view, those are important cuts to make. Defense has been bloated, but it's also from the non-defense discretionary side of the budget, and that's Pell Grants. You know, think about the enrichment opportunity slide. Think about the college completion slide. Pell Grants are exactly the medicine that you'd want to think about in this context if you're thinking what kind of public policy will help correct the depressing opportunity impact of inequality. You think of Pell Grants. You might think of pre-K, Head Start, NDD budget. So we have to overcome these mobility barriers that have grown with inequality, and the NDD budget is where we do it, but it's getting slammed. Simply keeping with the cuts, even with the cuts we made. I mean, when I was at the White House, we used to go around, and I think that, you know, I think we did a lot of stuff right. But we used to, and when I was at the White House, we used to go around saying, you know, by the time, you know, our budget takes effect, NDD spending will be, non-defense discretionary spending will be at the lowest level since Eisenhower, which I thought was a terrible talking point. I mean, first of all, I don't think anybody knew what NDD or Eisenhower was. But why would you want to squeeze that part of the budget that funds mobility, among other things? Anyway, manufacturing policy, I think that's key, and I think it's key for Oregon as well. Both in Oregon and across the nation, manufacturing jobs have declined over the years, and partly that's very much a pattern with advanced economies. It has a lot to do with accelerated productivity growth in the sector. But the fact is that most recently, over the last few years, that erosion has kind of held constant, at least as a share of the job market. And so I think both in terms of offense and defense, we ought to apply manufacturing policy to help support that sector. In terms of offense, it means investing in key areas where markets won't go. Clean energy is one. And I can say more about that. I think I'll breeze through this, close the comments, and then take your questions. I can say more about any of these, because I think they're important, just kind of what do we do in the discussion. But also on defense. We compete with other countries. Oregon's a great exporter. We compete with other countries who manage their currencies to get an advantage such that their exports will be cheap and our imports to them will be expensive. And so we have to play defense there. When countries artificially depress the value of their currency in international markets, or for that matter, when we artificially increase the value of our dollar because we have some strong dollar policy, that actually hurts our manufacturers' ability to compete in international markets. So we have to play good offense and good defense. Unions, remember, at the heart of this argument is bargaining power for the middle class. And unions are key to that, and they're now something like 6.5% in the private sector. So a level playing field for union organizing is part of this. Higher minimum wages, as you have in Oregon, and I think it's been very good, and I think from what I can see, correct me if I'm wrong, the predictions about all the bad things that happen if you raise the minimum wage in a particular state have not come to pass here. I think Oregon's been a successful example of a higher minimum wage. Labor standards, things like overtime rules and avoiding wage theft and making sure workers are classified appropriately. Work supports, the earned income credit, child care, health coverage, investment in public infrastructure. I think I mentioned that already. And all of that requires an amply funded government sector. And here I'll just stop and say a word about tax policy in Oregon. I'm surrounded by experts in Oregon tax policy, so I probably shouldn't say too much. In fact, if I make any incorrect statements, experts in the audience will correct me. One of the things Chuck likes to point out is that the corporate sector used to pay 18% of revenues that Oregon collected, and now it's 6 or 7. If you're going to keep your revenues where they were in that kind of situation, you're going to shift the burden from the corporate sector to the household sector. There's no sales tax to speak of here. It's very important for our corporate friends to pay their fair share. If you're going to pursue this agenda, an amply funded state coffers are essential. People have asked me, I've had a couple of meetings today with different people around the state. People say, what do you think about a sales tax? I don't think that it's necessarily off the table, and I very much like what Governor Brown just did in California. Because what he did is he went to the public and he essentially said, at least this is my interpretation, my friends from California say this is right. He basically went to the people in the state and did something that I think we have to do at a national level. We have to have this national conversation that says if you want this, it costs this. You can't have this for that. And so if you want this level of education, California, and the university system is a jewel in the crown. If you want this level of education, whether it's university or any level, it's going to cost. And some of those taxes increases hit people over $500,000, but some of them are on the sales tax. And I think I think what's particularly worrisome about sales taxes now is there's this kind of infected notion going on in some states that you can just trade your income tax for a sales tax. That's a very regressive idea. Income taxes tend to be more progressive than sales taxes. That's the reason, the dependence on sales taxes is one of the reasons why state taxes are more regressive than federal taxes. So I think you have to make sure your corporate and your household sector is in line. But once you do that, a sales tax with a necessities exemption and perhaps rebates for lower income people is not a terrible thing. I personally like the idea of linking a sales tax to something very concrete in people's lives. That when you pay this, half a cent on your coffee, it's going to support education. It's going to support healthcare in a way that you feel, it's tangible. I think that makes sense. Okay, last. So we have this kind of bubble, bust, repeat shampoo cycle going on in the economy. And by the way, this is where I had that in the last verse before. I didn't go through that part of the talk just in the interest of time. Again, during Q&A, I'm happy to talk about it. There's some very interesting, it's not quite there yet in terms of getting over the empirical bar for folks like me. It's not quite as convincing as it needs to be, but maybe it will be. But there's this new research that's trying to link inequality and slower growth. And the linkage between higher levels of inequality comes through this bubble bust repeat cycle. Oh, CF, that's from reference to an earlier slide, a new paper by Cinnamon and Pizzari, who are a Washington youth. They suggest that if inequality were lower, we might be less prone to the bubbles and busts in the following sense. By dint of having such high levels of inequality, income concentration at the top, and flat and stagnant incomes at the middle, the only way for middle-class families to get ahead was to borrow. And man, they really did borrow. Leveraged up to the hilt, largely, obviously, in the housing, through investment in housing. And this fed back into the economy and enabled us to have a stronger, more robust consumption-driven economy than we would have had we not had this kind of credit boom. But it ultimately exploded. It burst on us. And it led to the Great Recession and the current slog that we're stuck in. So if inequality is actually related to that in ways that these authors explore, and again, I can say more if you're interested, if we can apply more oversight to the financial sector, I think we can get out of this bubble bust repeat cycle. A financial transaction tax would help too. A small tax on financial transactions, whether it's stocks or bonds or derivatives, that's a good way of raising revenue and probably dampening some of the volatility of the sector. Key, I've already talked about the last bullet, so I'm going to stop on my favorite point of all. It's kind of nice to end on this point because I like it so much. Full employment. I feel like we're going to go into a song here about full employment. PSE stands for Public Service Employment. Look, if the market isn't going to produce enough work, especially if support for poor people is conditional on work, which our welfare programs have gotten much more work-oriented, if the market isn't going to provide enough work, we've got a lot of infrastructure that needs work in this country. The most direct way to create jobs is through direct job creation. That's not as profound as it sounds. I learned that in my work on the Recovery Act. You know, when you cut somebody's taxes, there's a lot of things that have to happen for it to stimulate the economy. They have to spend it and not save it. They have to spend it on domestic goods and not imported goods. So if the economy isn't creating enough employment for people, we have enough work to do. The public sector should create jobs. Certainly in repairing our infrastructure, I have an idea called FAST, Fix America's Schools Today, which is retrofitting and repairing the 100,000 public schools across the nation. This is a very good idea for this time, and especially given that the government can borrow at such low interest rates. So I would say that in an economy with such low levels of unionization, the only friend, really the main friend of middle and low-income working people is low unemployment. That's why in that first slide, so many slides back, that showed the 2012 wage story, you have that inequality staircase reasserting itself again. Because low-income people simply don't have the bargaining power absent very tight labor markets. So we need full employment. There's a role for the Federal Reserve in there, and they're actually doing it. The Federal Reserve is pushing hard. This is particularly important here in Oregon. If you look at some of the work of the Oregon Economic Forum, or I'm sure folks here at the university have these data as well, you actually see a fairly significant deceleration in the rate of job creation, both nationally and here, and it's worse here. You also see a decline in the labor force participation here. The share of the adult population that's participating in the labor force, and it's greater here than it has been in the nation, the decline. So I worry about the extent of job creation here in Oregon. And I believe that if we follow this set of policies, it can help push back on weak job creation, on inequality, and ultimately on the opportunity that's such a key part of the economic, social contract that I think all of us carry around in our heads and in our hearts. And as Chuck mentioned at the beginning, there are two ways of thinking about this. One is that you're on your own. The yo-yos. Go out there, see what you can do. That's not serving us well. I think we're in this together. And I think if we try to follow this menu, we can push back on inequality, opportunity, and the lack of job growth in a way that will make a real difference in the lives of Americans and Oregonians. Thank you very much. So we have a little bit of time for questions and maybe answers. Is there a microphone? All right. Okay, you'll be loud.
Why do you think that there's not a national movement to get a cost of living to pull on the minimum wage? Not even unions are talking about this.
Good question. Yes, I'll repeat the question. Why is there not a... No, I'll repeat it.
Okay.
You can sit down.
The 8 states do it now. The rest of them do it.
Okay. and this is one of them. Why is there not a national movement to support an automatic cost of living adjustment for the minimum wage? There are 8 states that do that already, and Oregon's one of them. I don't know.
Thanks for coming.
There should be. I think, have you a little kid talking? Oh, okay, I just worried I was going crazy. I think it's because I think it comes right out of the model. It comes right out of the model. In fact, I think I even made that prediction. Something about minimum wages in here. Eroding labor, lower minimum wages. So I predicted that. Next question. No. What's going on in this country, in my humble opinion, is that high levels, one of the things that's going on, many things going on in this country, one of the things that are going on in this country that's problematic in the spirit of your question, very high levels of income concentration are blocking policies that would push back against inequality and return some of the opportunities that I believe are critical to achieving the key goals of America. And those forces that use their very high levels of income and wealth through a system of money politics are very well organized against ideas like indexing the minimum wage. And they fund think tanks who write glossy reports about how this will destroy the economy. And they probably establish economic professorships at universities that are not as high quality as this one, where economists teach incorrect and empirically indefensible arguments about this sort of thing. And they create a climate such that when the reporter goes to write the newspaper article that says, Governor so-and-so has proposed indexing the minimum wage to inflation, there are 2 sides to the argument. One side says it will be to help low-income people. The other side says it will crash the economy. Thank you and good night. That's what we're living with. And that's the problem. So I think this is a good example of concentrated power playing out in precisely the way this very simple model predicts. Let's see, I got sort of alternate genders here. In the back. Oh, okay. Well, sorry, sir. Go ahead. I don't have my glasses on.
Thanks for coming. I've heard the carbon fee. I was a science advisor for 2,000 churches in Oregon. And global warming, climate change is going to cost this country $11 trillion sooner than we think. I presented it to hundreds of politicians and others. No one dislikes it. And it rewards wise stewardship at every level, home, business, government. And we're not talking about it yet. We got to get there now. Basically, we're saying reward people who are proactive in enhancing the future, which gets us out of favor.
So let me just get to a question quickly.
So the question is, how much discussion is there about a real carbon fee, not a carbon tax, in the White House, and how do we accelerate getting it?
That's a good question. There is real, I think there is much realization of everything you just said, of the, I thought, very articulate way you took us through that is absolutely understood by folks in the White House. As an economist, I deeply understand the notion, which they call the Pagovian tax, the notion of taxing pollutants that have negative externalities and forcing the polluters thereby to internalize those costs. And that's something that every economist, even conservative economists like Greg Mankiw, understand and support that idea. So intellectually we're there. Politically, we're nowhere. As far as I can. Well, maybe not nowhere, but considering the problems as you said them, and considering the dimensions and the depth of the problem and how dangerous this is, I would say we're pretty much nowhere. I mean, you know, I was just thinking of the guns analogy. I mean, prior to Newtown, we were nowhere on guns, and that was obviously a crazy, dangerous, unsustainable situation. Well, we're nowhere on this, and I don't know what it takes. I don't know what the analogy to Newtown is. Maybe it's 100-year storms that come every 6 months. We already got that. So I don't have a good answer to your question. Other than the exact same answer I gave the last guy, which is it falls right out of this model, in the back.
Hi, I have my own opinions on this, but I was wondering if you could speak to public-private partnerships, specifically in higher education. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Public-private partnerships.
Yeah.
If you could just speak to your.
I think public, yeah, could you speak to public-private partnerships specifically in higher education? Well, I'm not, I think it's very important. I think less about it in terms of higher education. I don't know, I mean, it seems in many ways you have a lot of public-private partnerships in higher education. I mean, there are, I'm sure there are, well, aren't we in the Phil Knight building? Private money finds its way into public universities in ways that are not at all bad. So you know, I think about it more in terms, I guess in the context of my talk, one of the ways I think about that is in terms of infrastructure. It's actually quite hard for private capital to fund public infrastructure, and that shouldn't be the case. That shouldn't be the case. We should have a mechanism by which private capital can get a return on helping to build a bridge, helping to support a highway. Now, you have to think about the economics of that in ways that I won't go into right now, but ways that you should talk to your teachers about, your professors about. Because does that imply that every bridge that has a public-private partnership in it needs to have a toll booth on it so that those fees can feed a return on private investment? Not necessarily, but that's the way you have to think about this. Private investors need a return on their investment. Public goods, public infrastructure generates returns. It's productivity enhancing. So it shouldn't be that hard to figure out how to channel return on investment from a public-private partnership in public good construction to private investors. It's a good idea. Oh, you definitely get that.
Sharon, I'd like you to talk a little bit about your experience in the White House. I know that you chaired the that you would staff to the middle class task force, and it just seemed from afar that a lot of the discussions kind of got narrowed down to exactly which marginal tax bracket we're going to increase, and then I'm sure that there was this huge body of work that you did. And you talked about the brick walls that you ran into, and just give us some more context to it.
A little bit. No, I can't repeat it. He's recording for radio, and I'm sorry, I can't repeat that. It's just too complicated. Yeah, my experience. So the question was about my experience in the White House as the executive director of the Middle Class Task Force, and at least where I go with Margaret's question is the following. Margaret said that asked about, it seemed like a lot of the discussions might have started broadly in terms of how are we going to relink middle class incomes or prosperity to economic growth in ways that I showed you they have become delinked. And then it would, like, all of a sudden you'd find yourself talking about some very narrow marginal tax bracket or some, small rule about how things were written in a credit card bill that would be, give consumers a better idea about, what they were getting into, as opposed to larger connections of the type I'm trying to draw here. I think there is a real reluctance. I mean, let me answer the question this way. Unfortunately, I think that the difference between Republicans and Democrats when it comes to the economy has become too much of what I'm about to say. Republicans say, and this is a caricature, but and reductionist, but I think I'm right. Republicans say, you're on your own. Here's a tax break. Good luck. Democrats say, no. We don't want to screw around with the economy and market outcomes because they're sacred. But here's a program to help you. Okay? Neither side wants to get involved with what I call the primary distribution of income. Republicans, so think of the income that comes from growth. as market outcomes, or the primary distribution, and the secondary distribution. The primary distribution is market outcomes. The market does its thing, and income goes where it goes. Then fiscal tax policy comes into play, taxes, transfers, social insurance, and you have the secondary distribution of income. Okay, is everybody with me here? The primary distribution of income, market outcomes, the secondary distribution, market outcomes after taxes and transfers. Republicans say market outcomes are fine. Democrats say market outcomes are fine, but we should do more in the secondary. Nobody says, let's do something about the market side of the thing, which means unions, which means minimum wages indexed to a COLA, which means manufacturing policy, which means investments in areas where the markets won't go, like deeper investment in clean energy, which means carbon taxes on negative externalities. These are mechanisms that would move markets in ways that are more equitable, but that's off limits. Now, it didn't used to be off limits. It used to be the purview of government. PSEs, full employment. Imagine if you were the government that had the same sort of mindset that Ben Bernanke has right now. I mean, Ben Bernanke is the only guy in Washington who seems to care about unemployment, and he's the chairman of the Fed, and not a radical lefty. Imagine you were saying, boy, we got to do something about unemployment. I got to get up and worry about unemployment, not the budget deficit, because that's way out there, but I'm worried about unemployment. You would create jobs. And you'd say, we have infrastructure, we have low borrowing costs, but that, direct job creation, no, that's the market. We have to go indirectly through tax cuts and through, loan guarantees and through TARP facilities and all that stuff. So that's the problem. Next. Sir, right there.
Yeah, I would like to ask a question that economists can actually do something about. And that is defense spending. It's generally conceded that defense spending mildly stimulates the economy. Now, when Robert Kuttner was here, I said, well, how much of defense spending is actually spent in the United States versus overseas, and where would I get that information? He said he didn't know, which I think is a pretty significant thing when a prominent economist doesn't know how much defense spending goes overseas. The bottom line here is if it goes overseas, it's not stimulating the U.S. economy. And why is it that economists are not concentrating on defense spending and determining whether it actually does stimulate or not?
So, defense spending, why, if it goes overseas, I'm trying to repeat the question.
Yeah.
If it goes overseas, it's not stimulating our economy, it's stimulating somebody else's economy, and why aren't economists doing more, about that? Well, the bulk of defense spending is here. My guess, and I don't know the answer, but my guess would be maybe 20% is overseas. Maybe, I don't know. I do know that we spend a lot overseas, and if you've ever been to a base in Germany or for that matter in Iraq and Afghanistan, you see very significant expenditures. But to me, the issue is less that one, I got to say. I take your point, and more about just getting the defense budget down to size. I think that's the key issue there. And you might say, well, isn't that anti-Keynesian? Like, Reagan actually got a lot of traction out of military Keynesianism by expanding the defense budget considerably in the 1980s. And in fact, there are contractionary effects for that, and I think they should be done. That kind of thing should be wound down slowly. And in fact, there have been defense has been on the table in ways that I think have been salutary for our budget conversations. I actually think this is a rich area of inquiry. I study others on this. I don't do this research myself. There are very good people, I'm looking at Margaret, because it might be someone you want to have out here at some point, who think a lot about the defense budget and what it ought to be. Basically, you've got a lot, and this won't surprise you, you've got a lot of people in the defense industry fighting not the last war, but the war before the last war, and not recognizing that contemporary defense is probably a lot less expensive than what we're thinking about today. Sir?
Is there any recognition in the field that you are an expert in to the fact that inequality creates a lot more violence in our country? and that in fact that violence is what empowers the Republicans to be in office because it creates this division amongst middle and poor class?
Not enough, not enough. I mean, it is a great question, and interestingly, it's sort of what I was saying in my talk. We started by just looking at inequality, and it wasn't until quite recently that we started asking, what kind of impacts is this having? Impacts on health have been investigated and have been found to be considerable. And interestingly, this really kind of blew my mind. It's at least a few studies. I would say this is, don't go writing a blog about it, but actually a blog would be fine on this. Don't go telling your professor this is true, because there have only been a few papers on this. In the UK, they had increasing inequality, but it was not like ours, where incomes were going down at the bottom and up at the top. They were going up at the bottom, but up a lot faster in the top. And even there, they had worse health outcomes, even while incomes were rising, but rising in an unequal way, much more than they had in the past. That led somehow to more unequal health outcomes. So, and so in health, we've looked at it, vis-a-vis opportunity, particularly education. I'm not aware of anything linking inequality and violence, but it's a good question. Let me see, sort of yellow?
Certainly James Gilligan in his book Preventing Violence has proposed a link between inequality and violence.
Okay, that's good to know.
Also, I have a linked question to this. I have concerns as a social scientist about the link between inequality and the level of happiness in society, inequality and the level of social trust in society. And there's research on all of these topics. And when I see the focus on the economics, and you've got to focus on equality of opportunity. Well, equality of opportunity is important, but even if you have equality of opportunity, you can still make a moral case for reducing inequality on top of that.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great point. I think that there are, my 13-year-old daughter tells me that in her middle school, because I guess she saw me writing about inequality, she tells me in her middle school that they're talking about inequality all the time. That they have courses in history where they're talking about inequality, much in the spirit that you're talking about, just fairness, happiness, just discrimination. And I think that's really important. Obviously, I'm coming at it as an economist. I will tell you this. You make a good case, a good point, and you're right, of course. But that's, at least in the world I live in, of Washington, D.C., that's pretty esoteric. And if I went to a meeting with the National Economic Council in the White House like I used to do, and I said, I have evidence that inequality is hurting happiness, they would all start laughing. If I said I have evidence that inequality is hurting growth, or inequality is blocking educational opportunity, that might get taken more seriously. Not because they don't believe that inequality could influence happiness the way you said it, but that it's such a hard sell politically. And so I think it's fine to start with the focus that I'm trying to start with here on kind of variables that are in the public policy mix. But your extensions are very important, and I encourage you to pursue them. Okay, we have a lot. You know what I think I'll do? If you could make your questions concise, I will write them down, and we'll just go sort of take a bunch of questions, and I'll see what I can do. Because I think we're probably getting, how much time do we have? Okay, whatever I want. So I want about 10 more minutes or something. Right there, the woman. I hesitate to call people men and women because I don't have my glasses, but I'm going to say you're a woman. You speak up, please. Okay.
But in your model, everything hinges on growth.
Right.
And of course, any candidate for office or any municipal administrator or county administrator, state administrator also says the same thing, it all hinges on growth. And so in order to facilitate growth, we have all these economic development strategies, and what they come down to is creating jobs, which I see you in
big goal of mine.
That's your favorite idea, creating jobs. But you're saying the public sector should create jobs.
Right. Okay.
school nurses,
I-
more sheriff's deputies.
I get you.
We're giving money away to welfare.
So you and I
services.
are on, let me stop you because we just have about 10 minutes, I want to get other questions. You and I are on exactly, I think on exactly the same page, believe it or not. I have been, in fact, this very day, I was inveighing in various meetings with people around the state, in the car a lot, about the phony job creation promises of the very types of tax policies you're describing. In my speech, in my talk, I disparaged them as supply side trickle down. The idea that if you give tax cuts to wealthy people and wealthy corporations, they're going to create employment. No. I mean, what you're going to find is that you erode your tax base, and clearly, right, exactly. Clearly, eroding your tax base is inconsistent with an amply funded government in order to accomplish the things that I've set out in my agenda here. And you're going to further enrich the profitability of the very top slice. That's what those tax cuts do. That's what those tax, they boost profitability. And I'm not saying someone said, well, are you telling me if you were the governor and you're negotiating with Nike, you'd say, Nike, go screw yourself or something like that? You know, of course not. I would negotiate with Nike. But I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't believe that if I give them a 30-year, lock in a 30-year tax break, that's going to, you know, mean job creation. I know that. And so, in my view, we need revenue in order to invest in the kind of employment that I think will help create public goods, will help provide needed services, and will take jobs that are of mediocre quality and make them better. Oh my goodness, there's just so many questions. Okay, this person right here.
This is Eugene, and no meeting in Eugene can end without uttering the word sustainability. And that word so far has been missing. It connects to the question about global warming, but it's broader than that, because we've got peak oil, we've got commodities that we're running out of, and growth, it seems to me, could be, if it's not done correctly, the enemy of sustainability. And if what you're advocating isn't done correctly, we could be just accelerating the problems of
so let me say,
unsustainable
there's
economy.
a bit of a misunderstanding here. The growth, in the top part of this model, which is what I call normal times, the growth is not something that I'm saying is like the be-all and end-all. I'm saying it happens. Economies grow. My only point is that take growth out of the model for a minute and just say, look, if the economy's not growing, I think we're all kind of screwed. And maybe that I'm like locked in a weird economist mindset, but you know, growth. My point is growth is necessary but not sufficient. But absent growth, I don't see how, with an increasing population and the level of needs I see in the middle and lower income families, I don't see how absent growth we're going to allow people. I don't see how we're going to facilitate, at least one of my goals here, which is the realization of your potential. So, but I'm just saying that I'm not saying that growth is the be-all, and I'm saying growth happens in economies. Economies grow. Yes, they have to grow in a sustainable way, but I've never understood, and that has to do, for me, that gets back to the earlier question about carbon taxation. That to me is a great incentive towards sustainable growth. But I've never understood, and again, I may be limited in this sense, I've never understood how we accomplish the goals of more broadly shared prosperity, without growth. I'm not saying it has to be at a certain level, or it has to be faster or slower, but I am saying that there has to be income growth before you have income distribution. Okay, in the back with the stripes on your shirt?
Thanks. You talked about the political hard sell.
Speak up a little bit.
Oh, you talked about the political hard sell.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you had considered or could speak to how you would sell your Fix America Schools.
Oh, yes, thank you. So how would you sell the political hard sell? How would you sell your Fix America Schools today? I've already sold it. Fast is a bill. that is in Congress, introduced by Sherrod Brown and Rosa DeLauro. FAST showed up in the American Jobs Act as proposed by the president. So sometimes good ideas do kind of show themselves. And in fact, I was told that FAST was the first program that was developed on a blog site that ended up in a jobs document. I took some pride in that. The question is getting from there to legislation, and that involves tangling with politics, which gets you right back to the predictions of the model. But it's on there. Over there in the back.
Given Figure 1's explanation of wages rising at 2 rates upward steadily, and that Figure 2 shows a reflection of how much of that money is spent on whatever goods and services comprise the life world so many decades on, how does your model reflect on not just the sustainability of goods in the world, as was expressed before, but in an economy that's going to sustain itself only by being more, exponentially more grown than it was a decade before, until wages might be something that looks like, some of a scientific chart?
So I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, but let me answer the question I understood. And I think this speaks to the sustainability question that you asked as well. I didn't go into this part of my model, but one of the things that drove the boom of the 2000s was overconsumption of housing. I think this is widely understood. And there is a set of arguments now that link that to inequality in ways that I alluded to in my talk, where middle-income people are experiencing stagnant incomes. In order to get ahead, they have to borrow. That interacts with financial deregulation, securitization, financial innovation, high income concentration, large levels of loanable funds, and very low interest rates, to support a credit bond. So keep that in your mind. That's one of the things that happen, and I think that's inconsistent with sustainability. Ever larger homes and ever larger leveraging up in debt. I think it's inconsistent with sustainability. And I think it's inconsistent with growth because it explodes. It's a bubble. In the U.S., we consume 70% of our GDP. 70% of our GDP is consumer spending. 70% of our GDP is consumer spending. It's the highest of any advanced economy, I think. The average for Europe is 55%. I think that sounds to me like a more sustainable equation. That doesn't speak to growth. You could have a GDP growth rate of 2.5% that is investing in clean energy and consuming less housing or inefficient health care or meat, for example. So I think that instead of kind of giving growth a bad rap, I think you should think more about the composition of growth in the context of sustainability. Okay, one more question. Chuck, you pick. Okay, let's see. The gentleman in the very back was stretching his hand way out.
Okay. Our public sector workers are being laid off in favor of contracting out their services, particularly our paramedics and our nurses. Are we being sold a lie in the name of budget cuts, or is this just another attack on employee unions?
Well, it could be both.
But is it work out in the
No, it's not a budget save. I mean, it's just a cost shift. It's not a cost save. And there is research. I posted it on my blog. There's not enough of this, and I'm not. Again, this is kind of a study or two, so I don't want to assert this as if it's stylized facts. But there's research that I found pretty compelling, pretty granular research that went in and looked at the costs of outsourcing government jobs versus insourcing them, and found that there are no true savings to be had. You can certainly shift costs onto the private sector, but that's just cost shifting, it's not cost saving, it doesn't increase efficiencies. And yes, of course it's an attack on public sector unions. That is a stylized fact. I mean, you can read that in the New York Times. I mean, the public sector unionization rate is still around 35%, something like that, but it went down a point last year, and that seemed directly connected to the attacks on unions. Thank you very much. Great question.